Hello, good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Economics Unbound. Tonight we take a look at the global economy during the COVID-19 pandemic and what lies ahead, including South Africa. Now, the global recovery is stronger than previously expected, but not all countries are recovering at the same rate. Some are forging ahead, whilst others, well, they're being left behind, it seems. Like many African countries, South Africa has a significant opportunity to benefit from the combined effect of a faster global recovery, higher commodity prices and easing monetary conditions. But taking this opportunity will depend on our ability to implement domestic reforms. At the same time, there are many risks to the outlook, including the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and also the uncertainty about the sustainability of the emerging market debt in a period of rising global interest rates.
Good evening, dear viewer. Well, actually, Kenya remains one of the fastest growing economies in Africa and is expected to bounce back to almost 8% growth in 2021. The expected rebound is premised on the normalization of economic activity due to a full reopening of the economy, driven by recovery through key sectors with mining, construction, and agriculture already showing strong improvements, the successful implementation of its economic recovery strategy, and the country's capitalizing on an expected improvement in external liquidity and benefiting from initiatives to meet its external financing needs.
Well, in Africa, this same divergence of outcomes is evident. The COVID-19-induced economic contraction didn't impact all countries equally. Some African countries, including South Africa, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, and Algeria, fall into the severely affected category. And that talks about GDP contracting more than 4% in 2020, whilst others include countries like Ghana, Kenya, Angola, Egypt, Eswatini, which suffered only moderate or no effects at all, that is less than 4%. Now, without faster growth, South Africa is unlikely to reach 2019 output levels before 2023.
Amongst the major regional economies, Nigeria only saw a decline of 1.8% in 2020, but is expected to grow at a modest 2.5% and 2.3% in the following 2 years, supported by higher oil prices. South Africa was harder hit, contracting 7% in 2020 and is forecast by the IMF to see a growth of 3.1% and 2% in the coming years. Even within Africa, there is significant disparity between those forging ahead and those being left behind. Zambia expects growth of only 0.6% in 2021, reflecting falling demand for copper, high inflation, wide fiscal deficits, and unsustainable debt levels.
Despite recent vaccine approvals, lifting hopes of a turnaround in the pandemic later in 2021, renewed waves and new variants of COVID-19 virus pose concerns for the global economic outlook. Emerging market and developing economies are also projected to trace diverging recovery paths. The International Monetary Fund has revised upward South Africa's economic growth projections. The multilateral institution now expects the local economy to grow to 3.1%, up from an earlier 2.8%. The economy contracted by 7% last year and has results of the shock exerted by COVID-19 and the associated lockdown. IMF says the biggest risk to growth is still the pandemic, with new variants that evade vaccines that could lead to a sharp downgrade. The IMF says despite a tentative economic recovery, some of the impact of COVID-19 will remain with us for some time. The organization says income inequality will likely increase significantly as a result of the pandemic. Close to 95 million more people are estimated to have fallen below the threshold of extreme poverty in 2020 compared to pre-pandemic projections. Economists say this is largely thanks to policy responses to COVID-19 pandemic. Emerging markets and developing economies are also projected to trace diverging recovery paths. The pandemic, it said, is expected to reverse the progress made in poverty reduction across the past 2 decades. Close to 90 million people are likely to fall below the extreme poverty threshold during 2020 to 2021. More insights with my colleague, Peter Ndoro.
Prudence, thanks very much indeed. Well, let's continue with that story and looking at South Africa now. South Africa's real GDP per capita stopped growing in 2007 and has fallen to its 2005 level now. By contrast, other emerging markets have more than doubled their per capita income over the past 2 decades. South Africa's decline reflects low economic growth combined with relatively fast population growth. COVID-19 and the impact on economic growth has further worsened these trends. Enabling embedded generational projects within the next 12 months is urgent to drastically reduce the load shedding over the short and medium terms and is therefore the only way to enable an economic recovery. Well, to unpack more of South Africa's economic outlook is the IMF resident representative for South Africa, Max Alia. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Good evening, Peter. Thanks for inviting me to be here with you.
All right, so we'll chat about South Africa, but I want to start with a global picture so that we can get a context of where we fit. Globally, it looks like that the recovery is doing better than had been anticipated. Why is that, do you think?
Well, I think, as you pointed out, we have revised upwards our growth projections, both for the global economy and more also for sub-Saharan Africa and for South Africa also. There are a number of things. Obviously, first, the good news about 2020 was the contraction in output in all the regions was less than initially projected or feared. The world economy contracted by 3.3%. In the case of Africa, South Africa, the decline was 7%. For 2021, what we have noticed at the global level, first there was some positive data, better than expected data in the last quarter of last year and the first quarter of this year. In addition, some of the advanced economies are adding additional fiscal support, as have been seen by the US, the European Union, and other countries. This will further support the recovery. And also, we see the rollout of the vaccine is proceeding relatively fast in places like the US, somewhat slower in Europe, faster in the UK, and we are optimistic that we will see a vaccine-led rebound in the second half of the year. So that's at the global level, and that's why we're now projecting growth of 6% for the global economy.
All right, and then we come to our continent now. And the thing about Africa is you almost have different continents within the continent because the economies are so diverse and so different. But by and large, I suppose if we take out the top performers, the rest of them seem to be showing better promise.
Yeah, it's correct. I mean, this is the region, sub-Saharan Africa is very diverse. We could see it last year, for example, on the impact of the pandemic. We have tourism-dependent economies suffering the most, then commodity-producing economies also suffering significantly because of the decline in commodity prices. And while we saw that more diversified economies are more diversified economic base, doing better, and also expected to have a stronger recovery this year. In the case of South Africa, I would say it's important to note. First of all, we saw the stronger data at the end of last year. That one of the factors that led us to revise the projection from 2.8 to 3.1% growth this year. We also expect the stronger global recovery to have spillovers into South Africa, positive spillovers. And we are seeing that already with the higher commodity prices that have materialized over the last few months and continue to remain strong. In addition, these are the big things that we see in the favor of South Africa. On the other hand, we know that the pace of rollout of the vaccine has been slower than in other regions. There's also a risk of a possible third wave of the pandemic. That's hard to predict. But if we look at the developments in other regions, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, where they had a relatively good summer and then they had all these waves in the wintertime. Well, now South Africa, but Southern Hemisphere in general, South Africa in particular, are entering into this wintertime. So we don't know, and that is a risk, especially because of the slow pace of the rollover of the vaccine. Furthermore, we had these episodes of load shedding, especially during the first quarter. Many of them related to unscheduled maintenance of some of the plants, the electricity generating plants. So if the load shedding challenge is not resolved, that obviously weighs on the projections and the prospects and the outlook for South Africa.
All right. I suppose you've kind of helped me get into the next level of the questions, because so we have the potential, there's this big contingent liability that might be what COVID does and how we manage it in terms of the vaccine rollout. But at the same time, it seems as if there's a lot of things that we can and must engineer to be prepared for a potential rebound in our economy.
Oh, well, absolutely. I think, obviously, I would say that the biggest priority in the near term is obviously saving lives, and that is obviously, having the resources to address if a COVID wave materializes, but also to have the needed resources to roll out the vaccination in the country. That's obviously the very first priority to ensure a stronger recovery going forward. Other areas, I think the situation in South Africa is, as was pointed out in the introduction, South Africa had some challenges already before COVID, with growth very weak for many, many years, and income per capita actually declining over several years. So at the same time, there was a period over those years where public debt increased quite rapidly. These challenges needed to be addressed even before COVID, and unfortunately, the pandemic has simply made these challenges bigger.
People keep on talking about we can never go back to where we were before the pandemic, because we were in crisis already, but that this pandemic may be an opportunity to do a restructuring of the economy. What might that restructure look like for us to be moving forwards in the next cycle post-COVID?
Well, definitely the structural reforms, the agenda that existed before COVID remains valid, it remains relevant. I would say one element I would like to point out is ensuring energy security. It's very important for an economy to grow, to make sure that energy security exists. And this obviously will require some reforms of ESCOM and the situation in that sector. It's also important to look at the role of some of the state-owned enterprises to make them efficient, make them financially viable. In a sense, by making them financially viable, they will not need so much support from the budget to remain in operation. So this is an area that's important to pay attention. A third area that we think is important is to foster competition in the products market, and especially, let's say, in the retail sector, to make sure to support that small and medium enterprises are integrated across the different value chains. So fostering competition is something that we believe is important to introduce dynamism to the economy. It's important also to look at the cost of doing business so that South Africa's competitiveness increases and obviously becomes an attractive place to invest. And also not only, say, for foreigners to invest in South Africa, but also for South Africans to invest in their own country. There are many regulations that can be streamlined, red tape can be reduced. But these are important areas that deserve attention. I think these are areas generally that we have been talking for many years, and they're important. I think the government has plans about this. They have developed plans that are broadly okay. They identify the problem rightly, and there are reforms that they're planning to implement. Now, it's important also to go a little bit beyond these reforms. I mean, the world is changing, the world economy is changing. So, for example, the world is becoming more digitalized. So digitalization, promoting digitalization is important in a new world, and to attract industries that are in the higher end of the value chain. And as a parenthesis here, I think something that is important, if, for example, is to move forward with the auction of the spectrum, because that's a way that will ensure adequate investment in that important sector. We also think it's important, an issue that's very topical these days, everywhere in the world, not only in South Africa, obviously, is climate change. So we believe implementing climate change mitigation measures is important. I mean, climate change is affecting all of us. So these things need to be put in place. It's also important to strengthen social protection systems. I mean, we have seen how many people, many segments of the population in South Africa and across the world have suffered significantly with the COVID pandemic. And as it was noted in the beginning of the program, it's estimated that about 95 million people in the world will fall below the extreme poverty line. For sub-Saharan Africa, the estimate is about 32 million. So strengthening social protection systems is important to make sure that the most vulnerable segments of the population, suffer less. I mean, this is really important. And another area that is important, and we see it everywhere, and as you can see, the IMF has been very vocal about this lately, everywhere, is about improving transparency and governance. I mean, the evidence across the world is that countries that have weak governance and problems with governance do grow less. So these are areas that really deserve attention.
All right, Max, Alia, unfortunately we have to leave it there, but thank you so much indeed for giving us some pointers on which way to move forward, and let's hope that those in charge do the right things. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, that's Max Alia, who's the IMF's country representative in South Africa, joining us, talking to us a little bit about what South Africa needs to do to take advantage of the potential that we have as the global economy does its recovery. We'll have more for you as we look back at 27 years of the South African economy right here on Economics Unbound. As South Africa celebrates 27 years of freedom, we look back at the shape and form that the economy has taken over the last few decades. South Africa's economy was already reeling from a recession when COVID-19 hit our shores, and that led to the economy contracting by a whopping 7% last year.
In 1994, South Africa had just come out of a recession. Soon after, foreign investors came to the country and the economy began to grow. Since then, it has grown by 3% per annum. In 2005-2006, the country went back into recession. South Africa was also not spared in the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. It began to recover, supported by the 2010 Soccer World Cup. However, the country slipped back into a recession again in 2018. Until the last quarter of 2019. As South Africa began to recover from the latest recession, along came COVID and knocked the economy to a 7% contraction.
South Africa, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Algeria fall into what we refer to as severely affected countries. In other words, they have experienced contractions of more than 4% of GDP in 2020. The IMF, in its April World Economic Outlook, forecasts that growth for sub-Saharan Africa will be around 3.4% in 2021 and 4% in 2022, respectively.
The International Monetary Fund forecasts economic growth of 3% for the country this year and 2% in 2022. Economists say for economic recovery to be possible, government needs to prioritize its infrastructure and vaccine rollout.
Clearly, there are two major factors that need to be overcome. The first is to start rolling out vaccines rapidly enough and to a significant enough extent to allow the economy to return to normality. In fact, the IMF indicated that one of the main reasons why it has been so pessimistic about South Africa's growth forecasts is precisely because we are lagging the rest of the world in terms of the rollout of vaccines. And the second important factor is it is no coincidence that the economy slowed between 2011 and 2019 to the extent that it did. There were major structural impediments, high levels of corruption and state capture, an inability to implement infrastructural investment programs, very few decent educational outcomes, and state-owned enterprises that were running increasingly inefficiently and were subject to state capture, and were becoming ever more reliant on the state to bail them out.
Professor Yanni Russo of the Wits Business School says government needs to get its ports and borders operating to get trade going and increase investor appetite.
So the government must get things like the ports and the border posts to work and to work properly. Then trade will follow, and with trade, investment will follow, and investment will lead to higher economic growth in South Africa. So the government's role in this economy is to make it easy and make it attractive for the private sector to do business in South Africa.
Earlier this year, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the country's economy recovery plan to revive the economy to its pre-COVID pandemic times. Economists say the enforcement of economic policies will lead to economic growth. Nothando Makutulela, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, joining me on Zoom is a guest lecturer at the Stellenbosch Business School, Jason Hamilton. Jason, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, and looking forward.
All right, so 27 years. It's been an interesting journey in terms of monetary policy. We've had different names, gear, this structure, etc., etc. And I just wonder, over time, when you look back now, what were the lessons I think that we could have picked up to have been in a better place today?
I think looking back is always an almost exact science. So I think it adds a bit of complexity to it too, because if you start looking back, it becomes quite easy then to sort of spot the things you should have done or you should have looked at. And I think even now in the situation we're dealing now, in just the last 12 months, if we see how things played out, there's potentially different decisions we would have made. I think one thing that obviously affected us, and from the insert too, we heard this about, I think the corruption we saw held the country back significantly over the last 10 years. And for me, the last 10 years specifically is very important, because post the 2008 or 2007 crash or global financial crisis is a time when the global economy grew significantly, and South Africa didn't benefit from that. We had very, very low growth and were severely under pressure. And while the world economy boomed, later on, I think towards 2018-19, we also saw a slowdown in the global economy. So while the global economy then started slowing down, we never benefited or had the 8 years of benefit of what they actually saw. And that then puts us obviously in a very weak position going into 2020. And now obviously we're facing very, very tough conditions coming out of this, as does the rest of the world.
In terms of policy interventions, it's always a difficult thing in developing nations, because you've got a social imperative on the one hand and an economic one on the other, and sometimes the two don't travel in the same direction. Has that been one of the challenges, trying to balance these two imperatives?
I think it's definitely been a very difficult balancing act. I think, and this has played out over the last 27 years, I think one thing that's interesting to note is, although we are still facing that balancing act going forward now, and that does have very big impact on society and the social impact that you can have, I think on a world scale, this has also been highlighted. So I think a lot of what we have been seeing, even playing out on a global stage, has highlighted the importance of not leaving any citizen or not leaving even any nation or country behind. So I think there's definitely a movement around that that's gone forward. And we've seen that narrative come through quite strongly. Obviously, we in South Africa have our own historical issues we also have to deal with, which we know we're carrying into sort of the tough 2021 year after the difficulties we faced during 2020. But I think there's definitely a new perspective from a society point of view and from a citizen point of view, from a united front that can actually be created in fighting a lot of these challenges. And this is obviously playing out not just from an economic point of view, but if we look at things like climate change, etc., I think a lot of those things have become much more real after seeing how something can actually have a global impact and what that actually means on various economies and how fragile economies are, but also how connected we are and all our supply chains, how connected and reliant they are on each other.
I suppose we can't underestimate, particularly when we are now glued to our screens watching the Commission of Inquiry into allegations of state capture, just how many own goals that we've scored, because if the figures are to be believed, that really has had an impact on some of our economic endeavours.
It definitely had. And I think you don't want to necessarily try and figure out which issue we created for ourselves is the worst. But I do think the fact that we had the corruption problem definitely is something that we are taking actions against, but it did set us back. And for all the confidence we did build up over the 27 years, I think definitely on the world stage point of view did set us back, because South Africa is still a very attractive economy and still the most industrialized nation on the continent, but we are also fighting for capital. I mean, other countries, if you look at North, East and West Africa, is very attractive investment destinations. So anything that then comes up that inhibits that makes it very easy for an investor to place his money elsewhere, which is what we've seen. And I mean, one of the things we can just talk about again is the ongoing issues from an Eskom point of view, and this is linked to corruption, is linked to some mismanagement as well, is the lagging effect of that. We're still sitting with electricity shortages and probably for a good few years to come. So the impact has been significant and it's actually ongoing, definitely inhibiting our recovery plans.
So what do we need to do? What are the... I'm going to make you Finance Minister, Minister of Economic Planning and Development. And what do we need to do going forward? We're hearing there's this backdrop of a global economy that's in recovery, so that there's potential for us there. But I suspect we really have to get our house in order in more ways than one.
No, we have to have a house in order, and I think a lot of the plans has been laid out, and it now comes down to execution. But I also think it comes down to very perfect execution in a very short time frame, which means we've probably bought ourselves a window of about 3 years. If we look at the stimulus in the US that's come out, the stimulus in all the economies actually globally that's come out, which is sustaining their growth recovery probably for a 2 to 3 year period. And I think if we look at the commodity prices being high, the commodity demands being high based off this growth, South Africa is very well poised to benefit from that. But I do think that once that stimulus runs out, we'll see the global economy at a certain base, but what economy will we then be dealing with? So I think South Africa has 3 years to make a very concerted effort to take advantage of the window that has been provided. And I think also context around it. It'll take South Africa about 3 to 4 years to recover to 2019 GDP levels. So again, although it's positive that we are growing and we have this global economy to take advantage of, and we can trade into that, and we have many things to offer the world, it's a very short time period to then say, where are we going to stand in 3 years, and how does that recovery or that building then post that look?
All right, we don't exist on our own. We are in a region, SADC perhaps more immediate vicinity, but the continent in the wider scale. And there's a lot of optimism around the Continental Free Trade Agreement. And I don't know whether I'm being overly pessimistic, but I get a sense that this is something that's nice to have, but the nuts and bolts of everything will take quite a bit of time to get right for us to start seeing some real benefits.
I think that is definitely true, and I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and an area is something that does, from a continent point of view, can make the continent very attractive for investment by making trade with ourselves much easier. And if we look at trade with ourselves, I think we trade about 16% compared to other nations who sort of the EU, which is standing at about 60 or 70%. So just shifting that to about 30 will kind of boost the African economy by sort of $500 billion, which is massive amounts. So I think a small impact there can make a massive difference over the long term and really uplift poverty, but it does require time. It's not something that's going to happen quickly, and we have to also have to remember the vision of one continent was, I think, brought in the late 1960s, and we're only really implementing now. So I think there's lag to all these things. The reality is most of the nations signed up to this, and yes, there is going to be teething problems, but it is a long-term plan. So I think, unfortunately, it doesn't give us maybe the short-term benefit we would want, but if we take a 5 or 10-year or 15-year view, which is how you shift economies, we could be dealing with a very different, well, South Africa, but definitely a very different Africa. And there's a lot of attention on the opportunity within Africa. But again, it's up to us from a continent point of view to make ourselves as attractive as possible for foreign nations to invest in us. And I'm talking about foreign investment, not portfolio flows. But it's really in our control to do that. But unfortunately, it's not going to yield benefits in a year or two's time. It's going to take a 5 or 10-year cycle before we see true benefit and sustained benefit coming from it.
All right, and we didn't even get a chance to talk about regional insecurity when we look at places like Mozambique. But that's where we're going to have to leave it for today. But thank you so much indeed for sharing your thoughts and your insights with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much indeed. All right, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have much more for you. Stay with us. All right, so welcome back. You're still watching Economics Unbound, and we have some breaking news right now that we'd like to share with you. And as you can see with the strap just below me there, it's very sad news indeed coming out of the Zulu royal family. A statement on Her Majesty Queen Shiywe Mantombi Dlamini Zulu, regent of the Zulu nation, has come through, delivered by the traditional Prime Minister, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who says that it is with deepest shock and distress that the royal family announces the unexpected passing of Her Majesty Queen Shiywe Mantombi Dlamini Zulu, regent of the Zulu nation. This, the family says, has taken us by surprise and left us utterly bereft. It is true that the Lord alone knows the days that He has allotted to each of us. He says that on behalf of the royal family, I wish to assure the nation that whilst we are all rightly grief-stricken, there will be no leadership vacuum in the Zulu nation. The announcement further says that further announcements on Her Majesty's funeral and the necessary arrangements will be made in due course. May Her Majesty, our regent, rest in peace. That's from the traditional Prime Minister, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, announcing the very sad news of the passing of Queen Shiywe Mantombi Dlamini Zulu, the regent of the Zulu nation. All right, so that's the breaking news. We'll have more for you in our news bulletins coming up, but In the meantime, let's return to issues regarding Economics Unbound. And Finance Minister Tito Mboweni says that South Africa was hard hit by COVID-19, which led the nation to experience a 7% contraction in GDP in 2020. Whilst the IMF has projected the growth in 2021 to rebound with 3.1% and 2% in coming years, there is still concern that the delay in vaccinating the population will lead to more COVID-19 challenges. Mboweni has called for partnerships around the world, saying the only true multilateralism, rather than narrow nationalism, is the way that the world will build better.
Kenya, and it's a very interesting case study, Kenya is one of the fastest growing economies in Africa now, and is expected to bounce back to almost 8% growth in 2021. Why? What is it that the Kenyans have done which is resulting in such spectacular growth? Firstly, the Kenyan government and to systematically implement the economic recovery strategy and made sure that every step is taken to achieve the objectives that they set. It's a very big lesson in how, when policies have been decided upon, these are implemented without fail.
So multilateralism is the way forward. Now, over the years, we have built one of the continent's foremost manufacturing plants in terms of size, volume, product variety, and capability standards. And we've earned a reputation for delivering quality, flexible, local manufacturing capabilities that meet the most rigorous international standards. Well, those are the words of Vinnie Perumal, who's the CEO of KS Africa, and she joins us now. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program. All right, it looks like we've just lost Vinnie. And we're curious about her views on industrialization, because this is a time where South Africa really needs to push forward. And some of the issues that I'm going to be trying to unpack with her is that what does industrialization mean in this modern era that we're in? We talk about 4IR, and that's the fourth industrial revolution, and a lot of people think of it in terms of digital and data and so on and so forth. So what happens in terms of that industrial revolution where we saw big manufacturing plants being built? Is that still going to be a key part of our economies going forward? Or do we start shifting to more knowledge-based economies, given these digital realities that we're living in? Well, Vinnie Perumal is a manufacturer of a kind, and she joins us now on the program. Welcome to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good evening, Peter. Thank you for having me on your show.
All right, so industrialization is something that's close to your heart. I know that last year you had a big investment in your company to increase your capacity. How's that looking?
So we are busy with quite an aggressive growth strategy. We're looking at industrialization, not just for SA, but East and West Africa as well. KS Africa is a leading contract manufacturer for personal home care and baby and oral care products, FMCG international standards and qualities. So our goal is to actually take this facility and replicate its standards in other African countries so that we all benefit from localization. That's driving the industrialization topic right now.
So let's talk a little bit about industrialization from your experience and how you think that this is going to help build our country and our continent.
So where we sit at the moment, with COVID having a huge impact on the disruption of supply our economy in other parts of the world, like China. And with COVID, we saw how exposed we were. So there's this huge drive to localize products that are currently being imported. And with that localization, obviously comes employment. It comes opportunities to export into other parts of the world, not just the African continent. And obviously with the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that's been signed, we're anticipating volumes to double across the continent in terms. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help us in terms of localizing imported products.
All right, okay. Perhaps one final question. What does industrialization look like in a 4IR environment? Does it mean that we are manufacturing with cleverer gadgets, or do we change the whole model in terms of how we make some of these goods?
So it's really...
All right, so Vinnie Perumal, unfortunately we're going to have... Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. We're having connection issues with your line, unfortunately. But thanks very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us this evening. All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you so much indeed for tuning in. You've been watching Economics Unbound. Coming up shortly, The Globe with Peter Ndoro. Stay with us.